So let's first talk about the simple enzyme substrate binding and catalysis equilibrium. So we consider all enzyme catalyzed reactions as sort of take two generic steps while making product. So first of all, you have to have a binding association, or the enzyme and substrate have to come together to form this ES complex where they're non-covalently bound to one another. And this first step is reversible, where little k wad is the rate constant or how fast they associate going forwards. And that is forming a non-covalent interaction or interactions between E and S. So those can be broken as well. Or there's a rate constant k negative 1 for the breakdown, dissociation going backwards. And these reach an equilibrium, but then some of the substrates that are bound to the enzyme will go on to successfully make product, and that has a separate rate constant K2. Now, in other equations, I'll write that as K cat, or the catalysis rate constant.